Welcome to Bright Ideas, a PTI Nebraska workshop on special education law, Part 4. This part continues the definitions of terms encountered in special education that we began in Part 3. In that part, we defined special education and related services, and child with a disability, parent, and special education teacher. Now let's get right to the heart of special education law. We've already seen it a couple of times, the free, appropriate public education to which children with disabilities are entitled. Again, we'll frequently encounter this term by its acronym FAPE, F-A-P-E, and it's important to understand because it's the central concept around which all special education law revolves. FAPE is an education available to all children with disabilities, as we've defined them, which is provided at public expense, under public supervision and direction, at no cost to parents. Like all education throughout the state, FAPE must first meet the standards of the State Education Agency, or SEA. In our case, the Nebraska State Department of Education. FAPE must include an appropriate preschool, elementary school, or secondary school education, and it must conform to the Individualized Education Program, or IEP, created for each child receiving services. The word appropriate is a key word here. As parents, we need to think in terms of what's appropriate for our child, not necessarily what's best. In advocating for your child, it's certainly understandable that you want the best services you can find. Bear in mind, though, that an argument for the best placement or service won't get very far with your local school system, especially if it's a costly option, because nothing in the law requires them to provide the very best for your child. What is required is that your child be provided with what is most appropriate, and that's what will be successfully written into your child's IEP. This is an important point to remember, as it's often the source of ignition which leads to a conflict between parents and their school system. Federal law mandates that FAPE is extended to all children with disabilities, including those whose parents are paying the cost of tuition at a private school, as well as those students who have been suspended or expelled from school. We'll discuss those special circumstances in later parts of this workshop. That said, there are some exceptions to the receipt of a free, appropriate public education. It is a requirement that an IEP must be in place in order for a child to receive special education services. Without an IEP, no services other than a standard classroom education are available to the child. Therefore, if a child does not have an IEP in place, perhaps for lack of parental consent or for any other reason, FAPE does not apply. Another exception is the case of a child between 18 and 21 who has already graduated, having earned a regular high school diploma. There are a few other exceptions which are too detailed to describe here. You're invited to call PTI Nebraska with questions should any of these exceptions concern you or your child. Special education adheres to the principle of normalization. Normalization involves making available to all persons with disabilities the patterns of life and conditions of everyday living which are as close as possible to the regular circumstances enjoyed by most of society. To that end, special education law provides that unless the nature or severity of your child's disability requires segregation from the regular classroom, your child should be taught in regular classes alongside children without disabilities, with the aid of any supplementary services such as paraprofessionals or assistive technology, which are required to compensate for your child's disability. This is known as the Least Restrictive Environment, or LRE, and school systems are required to avoid creating special classes, separate schooling, or other removal of your child from the regular educational environment unless the goals of the IEP cannot be achieved with your child in the regular classroom setting. Providing your child with the least restrictive environment doesn't stop at the classroom door either. Each child with a disability should have the same access to extracurricular and recreational activities as other children as well. More importantly, the law prevents the state and local education agencies from using funding, or lack of it, as an excuse to place the child in a more restrictive setting, nor can funding mechanisms be allowed to direct or control the placement of children in special education programs. The least restrictive environment stands on its own as a concept without regard to any cost involved in providing it. Child Find is the title of the mandate in federal law requiring each state to do its best to prevent a child with a disability from falling through the cracks. It's the responsibility of the state education agency, the SEA, to try to locate, identify, and evaluate every child with a disability who resides in the state, whether the child is homeless, a ward of the state, attending a private school, or being homeschooled. The goal is to find every child throughout Nebraska, regardless of the severity of the disability, who requires special education services, and ensure that they are at least given the opportunity to receive them. As we'll see in Part 5 of this workshop, the informed consent of a parent or guardian is required to actually bring those children into a special education program. And in the event that a parent is unwilling or unable to grant that consent, the law does permit the state to compel parents to at least have their child evaluated for disabilities. The part of the law which gives states that right is the portion dealing with procedural safeguards. The term procedural safeguards means protection, the protection of the well-being of the child. In the example just mentioned, for the well-being of the child, an evaluation should be performed whenever a disability is suspected, so the state may use its procedural safeguards to compel an evaluation even if the parent is unwilling to consent to one. Procedural safeguards can also be used by parents to advocate for their child in the event of a dispute with the school system over the substance of the child's education. In fact, the term used in Nebraska in place of the federal law's procedural safeguards is dispute resolution. We'll pick this subject up and discuss it at length in Parts 10 and 11 of this workshop. Some children may benefit from the use of assistive technology in order to improve or maintain their functional capabilities. Assistive technology devices might be low-tech, like a simple cardboard brace, so that a child with low muscle tone can sit upright in a chair, or high-tech, like a computer that allows a child to communicate via a pointer mechanism. Any item of equipment, whether used off the shelf, modified, or customized, which serves the purpose of helping a child overcome a disability and function better, is an assistive technology device. You'll also hear the term assistive technology service, which is any service that directly assists in the selection, acquisition, or use of an assistive technology device. Assistive technology services include evaluating the child's needs, providing, maintaining, adapting, or customizing devices, coordinating other therapies with assistive technology, and training the child, family members, and others involved in the child's care in the use of his or her assistive technology device. Transition is the point at which your child reaches the end of eligibility for school services, when he or she moves through a transition from school into adult life. It's a results-oriented process, focused on improving the academic as well as the functional achievement of your child in readiness for whatever setting comes next, be it college, trade school, a good job, or vocational training. Transition readiness should begin several years before your child is expected to graduate, usually in the mid-teens. Transition services are coordinated with other special education services, and as with other components of special education, they're based on your child's needs, taking into account the strengths of your child, along with his or her preferences and interests. These services may include vocational instruction to develop employment and adult living skills, experience in the community outside of the school setting, or perhaps practice in an actual job setting. Transition is an especially important time in your child's life. For this reason, PTI Nebraska has an entire workshop devoted solely to transition issues. Please contact PTI Nebraska if you'd like further information about transition. This concludes the fourth segment of Bright Ideas, an introduction to the special education process. Now that we've defined some of the terms you'll be hearing, in Part 5 we'll begin to explore the first steps in the special education process a little more in depth, starting with the crucial step, your consent to an evaluation.